The screaming echoed through the Montana wilderness as government agents dragged 7-year-old Mary away from her sobbing mother. The child's desperate cries for help in her native Blackfoot language would be the last words in her mother tongue she'd be allowed to speak for the next decade. Her small hands clawed at the wagon as it pulled away from everything she'd ever known, carrying her toward a brick building where the sign read, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, but which would become her prison, and for thousands like her, their tomb. This wasn't some isolated incident. This was official United States policy, endorsed by Christian churches and funded by taxpayers, designed to systematically destroy Native American culture by targeting children. What you're about to learn reveals one of the most horrific chapters in American history, a coordinated campaign of cultural genocide that masqueraded as education and salvation. Picture a Lakota village in South Dakota, 1879. The morning mist rises from the prairie as children play near their family's tipis, learning songs and stories that have sustained their people for generations. Mothers braid sweet grass while teaching daughters sacred traditions. Fathers show sons how to read signs in nature, how to honor the spirits, how to be warriors and protectors. Then comes the thunder of horses and gleam of government badges. Federal agents, backed by military force, arrive with legal documents that mean nothing to parents who never signed treaties giving away their children. The agents aren't here for negotiations. They're here for a harvest of children between ages 4 and 16, deemed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as the perfect age for civilization. This wasn't education. It was systematic cultural extermination using children as weapons against their own people. The plan was diabolically simple. Take children young enough to be completely reshaped, old enough to work, and numerous enough that within a generation, Native American culture would simply cease to exist. The removal process was designed to be as traumatic as possible, breaking children's spirits before they even reached the schools. Parents who resisted faced imprisonment, loss of government food rations their families needed to survive, or worse. Many parents, already weakened by decades of war and disease, had no choice but to watch their children disappear into government wagons. Children were often taken during seasonal hunts when fathers were away, leaving mothers alone to face armed agents. Some parents tried hiding their children in remote camps, but government scouts would track them down. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. Your children belonged to the United States government now. The train rides became the children's first taste of their new reality. Packed into cattle cars for journeys lasting days or weeks, many children had never been more than a few miles from home. They watched familiar landscapes disappear, taking with them any hope of finding their way back. Some children, as young as 4 years old, would soil themselves from terror, earning beatings from supervisors who saw this as evidence of their savage nature. But the children never knew if they'd ever see their families again, and many never did. The first thing that happened when children arrived was the systematic destruction of everything that made them who they were. The hair-cutting ceremony was perhaps the most spiritually devastating assault these children faced. In most Native American cultures, hair carries deep spiritual significance. It connects you to ancestors, holds your prayers, represents your strength and identity. Children were forced into barber chairs while staff cut away years of carefully tended braids, often while other children watched as a warning. The hair was swept up and burned, sending the spiritual essence of these children literally up in smoke. Many children believed their souls were being destroyed along with their hair. 7-year-old Joseph Horncloud from the Rosebud Reservation later wrote, "I can still hear the sound of the scissors cutting through my braids. With each snip, I felt a piece of my spirit die. They told us we looked like little white children now, but I felt like I had become nothing at all." After haircutting came the uniforms, identical gray or blue outfits that erased any individual expression. Traditional clothing, often made by mothers and grandmothers with sacred symbols, was confiscated and burned. Children watched as generations of cultural artistry went up in flames. The most devastating assault was on their names and languages. Children were assigned Christian names chosen by staff who couldn't be bothered learning their real names. A child named Standing Buffalo became Thomas. Firstborn daughter became Mary. Their native names weren't just changed, they were forbidden. Language suppression was enforced with savage brutality. Children caught speaking their native tongues had their mouths washed with lye soap that burned their throats. Repeat offenders were beaten with leather straps until they bled. Some had needles pushed through their tongues. Others stood for hours with heavy signs reading, "I will not speak Indian." They were told their culture was evil and that they themselves were born sinful. Religious indoctrination began immediately and never stopped. Every day started with mandatory chapel services where children were told that everything they'd ever learned was devil worship. Their ancestors were burning in hell. Their parents were savages headed for damnation. The spirits they'd been taught to honor were demons trying to steal their souls. Reverend Samuel Chapman, who ran the Phoenix Indian School, held special sermons targeting Native children. "Your heathen ceremonies are abominations before God." He would thunder while children as young as 5 sat terrified in wooden pews. "Every word of your savage tongue is a sin against the Lord." Children were forced to memorize Bible verses for hours each day, reciting passages about obedience until their throats were raw. Those who couldn't remember verses perfectly faced punishment. No food, solitary confinement, or public humiliation. Many children developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety, but staff interpreted their trembling as spiritual conviction. Sunday sermons became exercises in systematic psychological abuse. Children were forced to stand and publicly confess the sins of their heritage, to denounce their families as heathens, to beg forgiveness for being born Native American. Those who refused were denied food until hunger forced compliance. Pain wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged as a way to break them. Before diving into the most disturbing part, if you love learning hidden truths about history, subscribe and hit that like button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these suppressed stories together, finally giving voice to the children whose cries were silenced for over a century. The physical abuse at these schools was so systematic and brutal, it can only be described as torture. Children were beaten for the smallest infractions, looking up during prayers, walking too slowly, showing any sign of homesickness. The punishments were designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate and dehumanize. At the Carlisle School, children held heavy logs above their heads for hours until their arms gave out and they collapsed. At the Phoenix School, children were chained to beds and left without food or water for days. The Kemawa School in Oregon had a special punishment room where children were locked in complete darkness with hands chained above their heads. Winter punishments were particularly cruel. Children stood outside in freezing temperatures wearing only thin uniforms. Some lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Others developed pneumonia and died. At the Pipestone School in Minnesota, children marched through snowdrifts while staff rode alongside on horseback, striking anyone who fell behind. The instruments of punishment were varied and creative in their cruelty. Leather straps embedded with metal studs, wooden paddles with holes drilled through them to increase pain, chains and shackles that left permanent scars. Some schools had discipline rooms equipped with restraining devices that belonged in medieval torture chambers. But the physical abuse was just the beginning of the horror these children endured. Some survivors say the night was more terrifying than the day. The sexual abuse that occurred at these schools was widespread, systematic, and covered up by both church and government authorities. Children who had already been traumatized by separation from families, cultural destruction, and physical abuse became prey for predators who knew their victims had no voice and nowhere to run. Priests, nuns, teachers, and staff had unlimited access to children who'd been taught that questioning authority was a sin punishable by eternal damnation. The same religious framework used to destroy their culture was weaponized to ensure their silence about sexual assault. Children were told that reporting abuse was bearing false witness, a mortal sin that would send them to hell. At the St. Joseph's School in South Dakota, Father Benedict Peters systematically abused children for over a decade. When victims tried to report him, they were beaten for lying about a man of God. At the Immaculate Heart School in Arizona, Sister Margaret Rose used her position to procure children for visiting clergy. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical assault. Children were told they were chosen for these encounters because they were special, that it was God's plan, that their suffering was bringing them closer to salvation. Many developed complex trauma responses, believing simultaneously that they were victims of terrible crimes and that they deserved punishment for being born Native American. Mary Crow Dog, a survivor of the Immaculate Heart School, later wrote, "They stole our bodies the same way they stole our names and our hair and our language. They told us it was holy, that we should be grateful. I was 8 years old, and I believed them. The schools profited, while the children learned nothing but obedience." While these institutions called themselves schools, very little actual education took place. Instead, children were used as unpaid laborers to maintain the schools and generate profit for religious organizations. Boys worked in fields, shops, and laundries, while girls cooked, cleaned, and sewed. The products of their labor were sold to support the schools and line administrators' pockets. At the Carlisle School, children worked up to 10 hours daily in addition to minimal classroom time. They grew crops, sold at market, manufactured goods, shipped across the country, and provided all domestic labor needed to run the institution. The outing program essentially rented children out to local white families as servants, with schools keeping most wages. Academic education was deliberately limited and designed to prepare children only for menial labor. Boys learned basic carpentry and farming. Girls learned cooking and cleaning. Academic subjects like literature, advanced mathematics, and science were considered unnecessary for Indians, whose destiny was to serve white society. Even limited education was filtered through racial superiority and cultural destruction. History classes taught that Native Americans were savage obstacles to civilization. Geography lessons emphasized the vastness of white settlements and futility of Native resistance. Literature featured only white authors writing about Christian civilization's nobility. By their teens, many children had become skilled laborers, generating significant profits for their captors, while remaining functionally illiterate and completely cut off from both their original culture and meaningful white education. They existed in limbo, too civilized to return to tribes, too Indian to be accepted in white society. But the worst horror was yet to come. The systematic neglect and abuse was literally killing these children. Some graves were so small they could only have belonged to toddlers. Death rates at these schools were staggering and deliberately concealed from the public. Children died from malnutrition, untreated diseases, exposure, and injuries from discipline. At some schools, mortality rates reached 50%, meaning half the children who entered never left alive. Tuberculosis swept through dormitories like wildfire, spread by overcrowding and poor ventilation. Children showing symptoms were often isolated without medical care until they died. At the Phoenix School, sick children were locked in basement rooms and left to die alone, their bodies removed only when the smell became overwhelming. Malnutrition was endemic. Children were fed watery soup, stale bread, and spoiled vegetables while watching staff eat hearty meals. Many developed rickets, scurvy, and other nutritional diseases. Some children became so desperate for food they ate grass, tree bark, and even dirt. Medical experiments were conducted on children at several schools. Children were given experimental vaccines, subjected to psychological studies, and used as test subjects for new treatments, all without consent or knowledge of what was being done to them. When children died, their deaths were rarely reported to families. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, often in mass burial sites. Families might never learn what happened to their children, spending decades wondering if they were still alive somewhere. Recent investigations using ground-penetrating radar have revealed the scope of this hidden genocide. At the Carlisle School alone, archaeologists have identified over 180 burial sites. The Marieville School in Canada revealed 751 unmarked graves. Each discovery represents a child taken from their family who never came home. The graves tell their own horrific story. Many contain remains of children as young as 3 years old, toddlers who died far from their mothers, buried without ceremony. Some graves show signs of trauma, broken bones, suggesting violence, malnutrition that stunted growth, diseases that should have been easily treatable. The trauma inflicted on these children didn't end with their individual suffering. It created generational wounds that continue devastating Native American communities today. Children who survived returned to tribes as strangers, unable to speak native languages, disconnected from cultural practices, carrying deep psychological scars that affected their ability to form healthy relationships. Many survivors struggled with what we now recognize as complex trauma, depression, and anxiety. They had learned to survive through emotional numbing, skills that helped them endure abuse but made it difficult to connect with their own families. Some turned to alcohol and drugs to numb pain they couldn't express in languages they'd forgotten. Cultural knowledge that should have been passed down was lost. Entire generations grew up without learning songs their grandmothers sang, stories their grandfathers told, medicines their ancestors used. This cultural genocide was so effective that many tribes today struggle to revive languages and traditions nearly extinguished. Parents who survived often found themselves unable to show affection to their own children, having been taught that emotional expression was weakness. Some became abusive themselves, perpetuating cycles of trauma they didn't understand. This systematic campaign of cultural genocide, disguised as education and charity, represents one of the darkest chapters in American history. Over 150 years, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were stolen from families, tortured, abused, and often killed in institutions funded by taxpayers and blessed by churches. The discovery of mass graves has finally brought this hidden history into light, forcing America to confront that its educational and religious institutions participated in genocide. But acknowledgement is just the beginning. The trauma continues reverberating through Native communities, affecting suicide rates, family structures, and cultural continuity. Understanding this history explains why Native American communities today struggle with issues that seem disconnected from their traditional strength. The boarding schools didn't just kill individual children, they were designed to kill entire cultures, to break the chain connecting Native people to their ancestors and land. If this hidden history shocked you, hit that subscribe button, because there are more suppressed stories that need telling. Let me know in the comments what other forgotten atrocities deserve investigation. Remember, this systematic abuse was happening within living memory, carried out by institutions that still exist today. The voices of those children, silenced for over a century, are finally being heard. Their stories demand not just our attention, but our commitment to ensuring such cruelty is never again disguised as salvation. If this exploration of humanity's darkest secrets left you questioning what other buried truths lurk in history's shadows, click the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase.